Hello, this is the first tutorial video on using the new i2-connect-server framework. So this is a new project been working on to basically help people in building new connectors. And it really provides the ability to hopefully do that more easily, more quickly, and allowing people then to spend their time and energy focused on the actual data mapping and visualization aspects of connector creation rather than having to worry about so much coding. So I'm not going to go through too much detail now. We're going to just dive straight in. Obviously there is a lot more documentation here actually on the project page that you can read. But one thing I will point out before we kick off, just in terms of some of the tools that we will be using. So firstly, all of this is built on top of the Node.js framework. I already have Node installed. We're not going to go through that process here. Obviously, if you're following along, you will need to install and download Node.js. We will also be using the Nest.js framework. Now, this is effectively the technology that's underpinning the actual connector server. There's not really much we need to go into in any specifics around Nest today, but I'd certainly recommend that you go familiarize yourself with this. Again, it's not essential to be an expert in this framework, but just to understand some of the basic principles of controllers, providers, modules would be useful. And the other tool we'll be using is Postman. Obviously, it is possible to call REST-based APIs for testing and other purposes with many different tools and technologies out there. But Postman is extremely good at helping, especially when you're diagnosing, developing, debugging, etc. So I'd thoroughly recommend getting a copy of that. Again, we'll be using that today. And then the final piece, which we'll get onto later, but just to introduce it now, is something called JSON-Arter. So this is really a JSON transformation language. Allows you to take incoming JSON and turn it into some other format of JSON. And as you can imagine, in connector development, JSON transformation is a key part of the work. And JSON-Arter really allows us to take that out of code and into more of just configuration. Very elegant tool, extremely powerful. Can do a lot more than we'll be using here. But again, just to introduce that and the fact we will be using that later. Nothing you need to actually install though at this stage. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So as I said, I already have Node.js installed. The next thing we'll do is now to download the actual i2-connect-server framework. So we'll go onto the main GitHub page here, and we'll go to the current releases. We'll grab the most recent release here and download the actual package. We'll then open that up. I'm just going to now extract this onto my local machine. We'll drop that in here. Okay, so we've now got the actual server installation here unpacked. Right, next job then is to now actually install this in terms of all of the dependent Node.js packages. So to do that, let's now go to our command prompt. We'll go to that folder, and we'll then simply run the npm install command. So this is now going to go out to the internet and obviously start downloading all the necessary packages. I will add, of course, if you're in a secure environment, you haven't got internet access, there are other routes here available. But that is a much deeper, longer topic for another day. So for now, we'll just assume, obviously, the basic case. So whilst that's installing, what we're going to do now is also just introduce one of the other tools here that I'm going to be using. which is VS Code. Now, of course, there are other IDEs and editors available, but this is what we'll be using here during this current tutorial. It has a lot of features, and hopefully you'll see how useful this is going to be. So the first thing we're going to do here is to add some folders into effectively a workspace. So we've got them ready at our fingertips. So I'm going to come down here, add folder to workspace. And of course, the first folder I want to add is our actual installation here. It's for the server. So let's add that. Okay, and then the next thing that I'm going to add, and this is really just to help here into this same workspace, is some of the actual i2-analyze folders that we'll be using later on. So I'm going to also add folder to workspace. I'm going to come here to my local i2-analyze installation. Again, this folder may be slightly different depending on how you've installed the core products, but you should notice then this set of folders here. I'm going to go into the toolkits and add the configuration, because we will be using, certainly modifying the topology and other things later. And the final one I'm going to add, which is very useful, is the actual log files for the i2-analyze server. So I'm just going to come back here into the installation and go to deploy now, into the Liberty profile, and to our actual main server and logs. And also add that one. Okay, so that's our workspace setup. Let's just save that for future reference. We'll just put that back in here in the root. Okay, and let's see how our install's doing. Great. Okay, so all of our npm packages have now been installed. So our next job is to basically just prepare our environment. So if I just go back here into VS Code and basically just show you very quickly the actual core kind of structure here. So this is our install of the i2-connect server that we've just pulled down. Obviously you'll see here in the root directory many kind of common Node.js type files for those of you who worked with this environment in the past. I'm not going to go into all of the details here, except calling out one important file at the moment, which is this here, which is the environment variables that were used on startup. You can see things like what port we'll be running on, where some of the current folder structures reside. Now, in order for this to actually run, we have to create a copy of this, because this is just an example file. So we have to actually set this then as the real true environment file. So I'm just going to make a copy of that, rename that to what Node.js is actually expecting, which is simply a file called .env. And the reason we don't ship this directly is because we may end up putting some obviously secret values and other things in here in the future that are deployment specific. So we just have to create a copy, rename that. We're going to leave all the defaults as they are. We don't need to mess with that at all. So that's now good. What I will also just point out while we're in here, so there is all of the Node modules that we installed just a moment ago. And we do have some tests here if anyone's interested in actually doing some end-to-end testing for the framework. But the main folder we'll be really using later is in here. So in libraries, we have the core framework itself. So this is all of the helpers and utilities and other things that make all the magic happen. So we won't actually need to edit or modify anything that, but we will be certainly using some of those libraries later. And then in here is our actual connectors. So out of the box, as part of the installation, there is an example connector, which is effectively a copy of the same example connector that comes with the i2-analyze product, but obviously built using the new framework. And there is also here a starter connector. This is a great way to basically use as the framework the building blocks for new work. And this is what we'll actually use a little bit later on to kind of start our work. But for now, let's keep things simple. We'll get everything running, and we're just going to do that using this example connector here. One thing I will do though is I don't want this starter to actually start up when we start the server. So this is actually the first point here where I'm just showing you one of the key files as part of any connector is what we call this manifest file. This basically defines the entire setup and instantiation of a connector. And this bit here is key. This is basically saying to the server whether to load this connector on startup or not. This is all modular. It's basically, yeah, it will automatically load connectors. So it's very easy then to drag and drop new connectors into a running instance. But for now, we don't want this to start. So we're just setting that to false. Okay, so the only connector that now should actually fire up is going to be our example connector here. You see that's set to auto load as true. And again, don't worry about everything else in this file right now. We will be getting to that. All right, so we've prepared our environment. That's ready to go. So let's go back here to the command prompt and start the server. So we're simply going to run another npm command, run start, and this will now actually bootstrap Nest in terms of the framework underpinning everything, and actually then start our server. And as I mentioned, it will automatically load our deployed connectors. So you can see here, again, just to kind of talk through what's happening, you'll see here it's sort of loaded those manifest files that I was talking about. It's then initialized both the core platform and the connector. And we are now successfully started on localhost on port 3700. So let's just check that that is actually running. So we're just going to use the browser for now. Let's hop to, there we go, the i2-connect-server is running. So all good there. And what we could also do is actually look at the example connector. This is just going to bring back the connector configuration. Yep, so there's the connector configuration for the example connector. So again, hopefully those of you watching this are fairly familiar already with some of the basics of i2-connect. But this is effectively the main piece of information the i2-analyze server needs in order to actually talk to a connector initially to understand what services it provides. Again, not particularly friendly in this view here, but we'll be looking at this in more detail later. Okay, so our server's now running, we're connected. The final piece of this is obviously we now need to get i2-analyze, analyst notebook, to be able to actually communicate with our connector. So the final bit of the configuration here, and again, those of you already familiar with i2-connect setup should be already aware of this element of the configuration, is we now need to modify our topology file within the i2-analyze deployment. So we'll come down here. Remember, I added that folder earlier for configuration. We'll go into environment, and we'll go to the topology file. This is where we now need to add our connector so that i2-analyze is actually aware of it. So I'm just going to cheat here slightly. I have already got my snippets here that I actually need to enter. Again, this is standard stuff for the moment. You will see a slight difference in a second. So connector IDs, we need to tell here, this is our example connector. And then here's our actual connector definition itself, which then goes into this element with the connectors. Now you will notice that this is slightly different to normal. Base URL is the same. Here's our localhost 3700, where you saw me getting the configuration earlier from. Obviously the name ID, nothing unusual there. But notice we are specifically specifying here a configuration URL. And also notice that we are providing what is called a site ID and this strict mode here. Now, what this basically is doing is it's going to actually pass a specific site ID to our connector server. And the connector server is able to use that site ID to determine what mappings to apply to data that then comes back to i2-analyze. This is really a key tenet of the actual connector server, is that it can be made then possible for us to develop connectors in isolation of any particular i2-analyze deployment. So really getting away from that problem where you've got to then tightly bind schema type IDs into your actual connector code. We've effectively got an abstraction layer here. Again, we'll go into that in more detail later. For now, just it's a case of just copying and pasting this in, not worrying about this too much, other than it's basically just providing some additional metadata to our actual i2-connect server. Okay, with that, we will save this file, and we now obviously need to tell i2-analyze about this. So we'll go into our regular toolkit scripts folder, and we're now going to run the various commands we need to. So firstly, we need to stop Liberty. Okay, that's done. And now we need to update the connector's configuration, basically taking the information from that topology file and now actually deploying that into our actual i2-analyze instance. And then finally, we need to restart Liberty again. Okay, there we go. So we should now be able to open Analyst Notebook. And I now need to log into my i2-analyze instance, of course. Okay, I've just got the basic setup here with the standard law enforcement schema. The example connector that is provided does only work with that schema right now. And obviously we can modify that through the mechanism that I hinted at a moment ago. Okay, we're logged in. And what I will just point out, if we just come back here to our server as well, you will have seen that we did get a get-config request come in when we obviously restarted i2-analyze. So we know that i2-analyze has come over and fetched the connector configuration. So if we now go to external searches, there we can see our example connectors services available. And then if we wanted to, we could run one of these. And again, you'll see some activity going on over here. You can see that we've had a request come in for that particular service, brought back some results. Of course, we can then add those to the chart. So as I pointed out, this is basically an exact replica of the current i2-analyze example connector. Just grabbing data from a static file and obviously returning it back through these various connector methods that are available. Yep, so all standard stuff here. Okay, so there we go. We've, just to recap, downloaded the core framework. Obviously, assuming Node.js is already present, we installed that via npm and all the prerequisite packages. We then modified the installation just to make sure everything was primed and ready. We then added the connector into the topology file and deployed that to i2-analyze. And then we've come into Analyst Notebook and run some searches against that connector. Okay, so in the next tutorial, we'll now begin then to look at actually creating a brand new connector from scratch using the new connector server.